So let me introduce Paul. I met Paul Cole 18 months ago, networking over a few sandwiches, one of the last face-to-face local network events before the pandemic struck. I thought then that he had an interesting topic to share, so here we are all tonight. Paul co-founded powerQuad in early 2018, having worked the previous 10 years as a power test equipment manufacturer with more than 5 years as technical director. Both powerQuad co-founders are driven to help organisations during the difficult net zero challenge we all face. Working closely with clients, powerQuad provides high quality products and services to organisations looking to decarbonise and prosper in the near future. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Keith. So first, thank you to everyone who's attending this evening, particularly in the UK. It's quite a sunny day down here in the southeast. Take your time out of the evening. But first, I'd also like to thank the IET and particularly to Keith of the IET Local Berkshire Network for inviting me to present this webinar to you all on battery storage and how it will help in the recovery to net zero carbon. Before I begin, I'm going to ask you to think about your interest in net zero carbon. You might be someone who's in sustainability, in a carbon cutting role, or you're thinking about what you might want to achieve for your business and for your customers. Think about what you have done or been involved in so far, and most importantly, think about what you might be struggling and be a little bit frustrated with achieving, taking it to the next stage. And hopefully we can help you through those this evening. So as Keith has mentioned, I am Paul Cole. I'm the co-founder of powerQuad. powerQuad help businesses cut their carbon footprint by providing both engineering services and products to decarbonise. It's our vision to bring renewable energy to everyone, and we are working to help decarbonise our working world. In our engineering product sustainability, data, easy integration and automation are just paramount for the simplicity of doing this. Typical businesses that I've worked with include local councils and have used our services to carry out site surveys to identify their carbon footprint initially, moving on to what technologies will work for them. I myself has been in engineering in the power industry for well over 14 years, maybe 15 now. And previously, as Keith said, I was a power test equipment manufacturer and engineering company in Guildford. And for that, I was in the director role for the past 9 years. I enjoy product design still, and I enjoy finding solutions to problems that are both domestically and overseas. Much of powerQuad is driven by my past of designing products to meet the needs and the changing needs of our customers through enjoying solving their weird, strange and unique problems of our customers, working with them through the whole process, including asset management and their low carbon technology. So today's presentation, I'm going to largely talk about battery storage or energy storage, as it should probably be better worded. So energy storage, it's fundamental in the supply of electricity in the future. So it covers almost all aspects of current and future technology in supply and demand of electricity. Now, as power grids, that is to say, generation, supply and demand changes with decarbonising, flexibility provided by battery storage will be the key role to this success. And it's important to understand the need to decarbonise. So I'll present a section on data to show the rising levels of CO2 and the impact this has. Interestingly, the impact that coronavirus in itself, as this is a recovery to from net zero webinar, what coronavirus and the lockdowns has had on the worldwide CO2 levels. And then the rest of the presentation will centre on battery storage, the technology, system overview, and how innovation and R&D has developed this into a far more advanced package than may already be known. But first, why do we need to cut carbon? Well, when I say carbon, I really mean carbon, the negative effect that that has on our planet. So CO2, as many will probably know, traps the heat from the sun in our atmosphere, causing a warming effect, and that's a worldwide warming effect. This causes climate change, And climate change, although it's gradual, it is building at a very fast pace now, certainly for the last couple of decades. So it's important to look at the data. So top left on the slide now is a graph of ice core cuttings. So ice on the East Antarctic is bored. Scientists drill down to take samples of the ice. Ice itself is like a time capsule. The ice, it freezes, developing more layers with every year. And with every layer, air in the atmosphere gets locked into the ice. So drilling down to a depth of around 550 meters gives glimpses of over 8,000 years of the atmosphere. Analyzing those samples produces a CO2 level for the air at that time. When we combine this with more recent data that's live, such as that from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, we can see a high spike in the last 200 years. The information from Mauna Loa is extremely interesting. The sensors are alive and very accurate. So we can see this even in the last 40, 50, 60 years, how much this is making an impact. But so what? What is this effect on the planet and the temperature, and what does it mean for us? So we know that temperature records, certainly in central England, have been going since 1659. So we have a record over a much longer period. And we have global temperatures because of what was the empire, mid-19th century data. And the representation on the bottom left uses colours to represent the cooler years and red to represent the higher temperature years. This has been created by Ed Hawkins from the University of Reading. And these wonderfully colourful representations really clearly show how over the last decade or two, there's been fundamental shift into more red and warming categories. But what are the effects? So we know that there are higher temperatures, they cause extreme weather and so on, but there's going to be fires and floods. They're going to devastate things like crop production, food shortages. We're seeing this already on an initial scale. What's it going to be in the next 20, 30 years if we don't do anything? Let's just quickly recap. So we know CO2 is in the atmosphere. It's increasing more and at a very more rapid rate. But we need to know where it's coming from as well. What are the sources of this CO2 production? We need to target those to make change. For the most part, it is energy. It is the production of electricity and gas for heating and so on that is a main source of CO2. Transport itself is self-evident with the fuel of internal combustion engines. Residential is largely used there for gas for heating. And businesses also release CO2 from heating, but also chemical production, both petrochemicals and so on and so forth. Methods for decarbonising heating largely rely on the removal of gas. And steps are being made now to have things like hydrogen gas mixtures or hydrogen pure. But for many homes, gas is still not the fuel source, and heating from electricity is going to be the method to really decarbonise for the larger part of the world. And there's a concern to how quickly this can happen, particularly here in the UK, as to what that would mean for grid constraints and how we can actually develop that into being a more net zero entity. So I mentioned earlier coronavirus and what that's done to global and certainly UK CO2 emissions. So these two graphs here give a rather positive view of CO2 emissions from lockdowns. And the global drop of around 12% and the UK drop of around 25%, which is still currently predicted for 2020, is largely a result of lockdowns, people not driving, businesses being closed, working from home and so on. I mean, this is good news. No one can say this is bad news. This is really good news. However, it did also result in a 20% drop in GDP in the UK. That's not good. So we need to understand how we build back the GDP, work, jobs, growth, education, learning that maintains that continuing trend down of CO2. So I already touched on some of the new technologies for heating, such as heat pumps, ground and air source, infrared heating panels and so on. And in transport, much development is already taking place in electric cars and bikes and vans and lorries. So there's a lot of innovation that's happening in that sphere. Now, with all this non-linear generation from renewable power, higher fluctuations in demand through electric vehicles and heating, charging, and so on, the demand and the ability to shift our demand and load to protect peak power needs is going to be vital to decarbonising our working world. Just to give it a little bit of background still, let's for a moment look at the UK national grid and what's been happening here. So certainly for over the last decade or so, the grid has changed under three main drives. They are decentralisation, decarbonisation, and digitalisation. They all play a prominent role in the energy sector to pave the path for the national grid to target and operating on 100% renewables. At the moment, they still state by 2025, although I doubt that very much, but also the net zero target of 2050 that's still in play. But what are they? What do they mean? So decentralisation is really the shifting from large centralised power stations towards a localised power production connected to the standard distribution network. Now, with decentralisation, we are seeing smaller farm-scale solar taking a prominent role in this change. Collections of smaller residential or bio businesses generating and so on. There are also beginning to be community energy products, and we'll touch on that shortly. Decarbonisation, self-explanatory. You know, we're looking at decarbonising that certainly here in the UK with offshore wind, but also solar farms play a growing part in that too. Digitalisation is another very interesting sphere, which I'll talk about in a moment. Looking at how data and how digitalising energy can really help in the effective management and the monitoring of the generation, demand, transmission and distribution of the electricity supply as a whole. And the accuracy of that really helps make decisions on what we can do going forward. But let's first now, as this is a technical webinar, look at the basics of what is a battery system, basic battery storage system. So typically it's represented as an uninterruptible power supply. The system consists of an input power, typically an alternating current supply from the grid or local generator. The mains is monitored, it's metered. Monitoring typically looks at mains loss just to kick in to protect the downward output. And the input is then typically converted from an AC current into a direct current to prepare for power storage. Almost all devices of storage are on a DC, direct current storage. And so there's some examples of what could be classed as a battery. And I mentioned earlier, it's more just energy storage of sorts. We all know, and should all know, lead acid and lithium ion. Lithium ion is on everyone's lips at the moment. There are others. Flywheel is very common as well. That's a kinetic energy of storage. Hydrogen, chemicals such as redox, thermal and pressure are the main ones that are also still being used for storing energy. So they all have some form of a charging circuit to build up that power inside that storage device. And naturally, when the stored power is needed again, it further converts it back from the DC sphere into an AC with the output on, a basic UPS type system. But now we're getting these far more complex systems that are coming through the mix. And R&D, certainly in the time that I've been around for the last 5-10 years, in the last couple of years has been phenomenal in these products and these systems. And there's words that keep coming through the mix that I'm hoping to help answer and explain what they are as we go through this presentation. I'll just quickly go through some that you might have heard of so far. So we've got import and export of power. You'd have a solar input, a wind input. We're looking at grid carbon or local carbon. Is there a difference? Time of use tariffs are growing. Consumption times, are we demand prediction? Are we looking at price offsetting? Are we looking at CO2 offsetting? Generation, solar, wind, are we looking at grid carbon for prediction? Are we looking at excess, local excess? Temperature variances, battery storage systems, do they have temperature problems? Well, they do if you need battery cell life. What does that mean? Is it a long cell life? Is it a short cell life? Power cuts, we've mentioned this before. Mobility, are they fixed installations? Can I move them around? Can I take them out with me? Can I go camping with them? Multiple on-site systems. No longer are we seeing single standalone systems. You might have heard words like behind the meter and in front of the meter to determine where the battery system sits within the grid network. And then all of these words that crop through in the technical sphere, kilowatt hours, kilowatts, peak, depth of discharge, and so on, associated with batteries. And finally, I mentioned earlier, community energy, how communities are now all working together to support themselves as there's growth and to look after what's going on in their own needs as businesses and residential people. So let's look at a more complex battery solution now. So there's additional power elements that need to be taken into account, but much more of the expansions are in software, critically data and data management. The addition of solar and wind power and single or multiple supplies of inputs can be drawn in from power. Intensity factors of the solar and the wind will vary, and although they're very good sources of power, they only generate when the primary source, like the sun or the wind, is there. One further addition is the export of stored energy back to the mains, back to the whole grid system, and that's typically used, like I mentioned, in community systems to look after any grid constraints and local demand constraints that are occurring at that time. And then there's a lot of data elements that are now coming into play. So there's two controlling sources really. There's the cloud systems that are external to the system, and also data that's collected internally for the battery storage system to work fundamentally. But then both must work together and independently for an efficient system. Now, the cloud provides many functions for modern systems such as data providers, data storage, linking into other data providers, and also for mobile applications to access that data. And they're often third-party devices as well. So grid carbon may come from another source, pricing may come from an energy provider. There's going to be different sources of inputs and different people. Outgoing data to the cloud from the system is used to help in look at what energy demand, the energy demand profile data, such as are they connected to electric vehicles? Is it predominantly a heating system? Is it an office? Is it a residential? Is it an industrial unit? And so on. These all really help map what that system needs to do to give that user the best experience, the cheapest energy or the lowest carbon. Additional data such as the type of building can be very useful. What's its orientation for the solar and so on? Does it have a heating requirement? All of this really helps, and it's all added in. Let's look a quick look at the internal data and metering. So you'll see metering, I mentioned before, of the incoming mains and grid power. But additionally, battery monitoring now exists heavily in helping make decisions. The data sampling management is harmonious across battery types, as I mentioned earlier, flywheels and so on. But you're looking at they will all have the similar sort of metering, and I've got their temperature, the charge rate can vary depending upon the capacity, discharge rate, what it can give and when. Also cell balancing, making sure that it is kept at the best cell voltages, so we say, to extend the life of that. But also, do the battery types have anything particular, the storage device, have they got anything particular that needs to be looked at constantly to make sure the whole system is working correctly? So I've talked a little bit about how a cloud system will make decisions on behalf of the battery system, but it must also take into account the local user control to override those needs, to react immediately. Typically, a user will be sat for a general need for lower CO2 or lower energy costs, but there may be a mixture or immediate change that's also needed and required. So as you can see, battery systems are now extremely complex, and the use of cloud data is vital to how they can provide the best result for our needs. But let's quickly explore grid carbon and grid carbon costs. So we know that grid carbon fluctuates through the different forms of generation, but this also causes wholesale price variations. And these three screenshots for the UK, so CO2 generation price variations. And as you can see, lower carbon periods of generation also follow the lowest cost periods. And it's a growing trend. And we're now seeing these huge fluctuations that occur when there's a lot of wind and a lot of solar that often being missed because they're also at the time when demand is at its lowest. So we need to maximize these. So for a little over a week of 2019, as you can see, and the start of 2020, see the highest CO2 and the wholesale prices, on average, you're getting a difference of around 100 grams per kilowatt hour. Now, extending this averaging through more than just a day, we can see it can go to nearly 200 grams per kilowatt hour. So a basic system of 5 kilowatt hours is nearly a ton, well, nearly a kilogram of carbon. So I'll touch quickly on low carbon source of energy and what this means. So our national grid here helps show those achievements by what has been the days of the maximum wind, the longest periods of no coal, and these are all key performance indicators to the progress becoming net zero. So the fluctuations in both wind and the power generation are open great possibilities for energy providers, and they offer unique tariffs to supplement new technologies that are on the grid. One crucial technology is smart meters, and smart meters help provide that regular 30-minute interval of usage data and cost data, not only back to your energy provider, but also to you as the consumer. You can see when you're consuming the most expensive energy. So time of use tariffs like this provide, particularly the one from Octopus Energy, provide pricing in 30-minute segments, typically 24 hours in advance. And this is just one such example, and it repeats often daily to show that they can fluctuate prices between 24p and sometimes close to zero, sometimes negative, and you can get paid to consume energy, particularly when there's an excess. Now, I know around December and early January, there were 3 or 4 periods here in the UK where demand was outstripped from generation that caused a huge change and increase on what the wholesale prices were. We as consumers didn't see it because it gets hidden in our whole year's fixed tariff. But it depends on where you are as a user as to where you can take advantage of these renewable tariffs and shifting your demand. So the problem of peaks in this excess generation, as I say, is starting to open new markets, new grid supporting services, a better way of phrasing it, and they provide, it gives people in the position to provide power during those periods of grid stress, or to take themselves off the grid at those times and be paid for doing so. But unfortunately, at the moment, it's still an opportunity only for those who can provide very high amounts of battery capacity, typically 10 megawatt hours or higher. This is where we're now seeing community energy and people working together to provide those services to the grid. For example, households with a battery storage system can now sign up to give control of a percentage of their battery capacity to a third-party provider, or sometimes even the installer themselves or the manufacturer of those systems, to provide further grid services on their behalf, and they get paid for doing so. It's just very popular, especially in the early days of feed-in tariffs and subsidized solar generation. But over the past year, it's become increasingly common for owners of solar systems to look at battery storage solutions to take themselves off grid, no longer wishing to support the grid. So it depends what your needs are, it depends what you're looking to achieve. Battery storage, energy storage of any type, has the ability to provide those solutions. Most of what I've talked about so far has been for homes, but also for businesses. Businesses have very unique energy tariffs that are just very different in how they can provide these new services. So businesses, particularly very large businesses, will have additional charges called DUOS and CHUOS. So DUOS are charges for using the distribution system, CHUOS are transmission charges. Consumers, household consumers here in the UK, we still have them, they're just hidden in a daily charge. Businesses also can have multiple banded periods of red, amber and green at set different times of the day when they're charged for using their power. And red band can sometimes be 30, 40 times higher than what it is for a green band. So maximising your green banded tariff, and as you can see, there are the times when no one's in the office or no one's working, if you can maximise that by shifting your demand into those times, you're already making huge savings on cost of energy. So data, I mentioned earlier how data is now becoming quite a fundamental part of how systems and how we as businesses and individuals decide what we're going to do. And data, you know, it can be real, it can be metered, it can be from a known, it can be predicted. And models are used extensively in helping understand and identify the opportunities and changes that are needed or made to be addressed. For businesses, it helps identify where and when to invest. For households, it may just be, I'm happy it's going to give me a return in 7 to 10 years, except how long I want to own a home for example. But they also have their downsides too, and that has to be mentioned. They can be extremely inaccurate, especially if it's based on other models and you get the error that just carries through them all. Calculating averages essentially is an error progress, and it's important to recognize that whenever you see a model, whenever you try and create a model, that you're probably going to be 20 to 30% out if you haven't looked at the data in a much more metered or live scenario. The more live you go, the more accurate you're going to be. So here on these two graphs, just to give a quick example, I plotted demand data direct from the UK National Grid's free to view data. All the rows in their data is in 30-minute segments for an entire year. And data sets include solar generation, energy sources types, what interconnections we have here between France and Ireland and Netherlands, but also it helps show what the demand fluctuations have been over time. So here I just very quickly plotted mid-June England and Wales demand in megawatts. That's 336 data points for just 6 days. But just for a moment, let's extrapolate that to include solar generation, then extend it to a month and compare that to a whole year. That's already over 6,700 individual data points. That's for one consumer. Now consider the data for a street, for homes and businesses, multiple sites, departments and so on. The volume of data increases exponentially. But all of that is important in helping make those decisions. But what are these decisions that I've just mentioned? Well, I mentioned we could have easily tens of hundreds of thousands of data points. But if we include data points for solar for a month, but if we start looking at other API data that I mentioned coming in as well, CO2, weather, grid demand, grid price, future grid price, previous grid price, and the battery storage data, the meter, the protection, the capacity, the charge, the temperature, very quickly, an individual battery storage solution, such as the ones we have here in powerQuad and consult businesses with, can have over 80,000 data points for just an hour. Yeah, that's a phenomenal amount of data that needs to be managed correctly to help make those decisions. This will grow with time. But why do we need all this data and what is the point of it? Well, historically and currently, for many systems, it's to answer 2 questions: when to charge and when to discharge, and for how long for. But now all this data helps us answer far more complicated questions over a longer time-based period. And these questions can be raised at any time, not necessarily at the first thing in the morning, but any time of any day. And again, not necessarily requiring a live or immediate response. So it could be for things like fault finding in future investment decisions. So questions such as, which energy tariff is more suitable when I want to save money? I have a list there, I'll just go through them. How noisy is the mains electricity? How do grid faults such as spikes and surges ripple through the network? What will grid demand be at time X at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on July the whatever? And how much park charge capacity could there be in a whole geographical area? Let's say the southeast of England. How much protection have they got if there's a sudden burst or a drop in power? If there's a power cut for maintenance, how long can backup power be provided to the local hospital and so on? So all this data really helps make those decisions, and investments can happen far more quicker in upgrading networks and using renewables far more. So I'll talk a little bit now about how businesses we are working with have had questions that have been answered. Now it's important to note that businesses, they'll all have different needs to homes. And although the technology is transferable for the most part. A lot of the time, the software elements and the interaction they have with it will be very different. Legal requirements on some businesses, such as streamlined energy and carbon reporting in the UK, currently only a requirement for very large companies. However, it's reasonable to expect that this will extend to the smaller SMEs as time comes on. And we're already seeing many smaller SMEs volunteering to do this to help attract customers to their business. We all want to support those businesses who are being proactive within protecting the environment, and these businesses are seeing that, particularly post-COVID in the recovery. Now, it's not unusual for some businesses to already have energy-saving plans, including waste-saving plans, typically plastic cutting and single-use plastics. But those that don't continue to invest will really struggle to identify the best technology for them. Now, the technologies can be things like heat pumps, solar, battery storage, EVs, EV chargers. Which one is good for them? Which one works for them in their next net zero phase? I say many of them are really struggling to work out what that means. Shaving peaks, are they scrutinised for taking power in the red bands? What do those technologies actually do for them? Everyone is different. Coupled with businesses needing to consider their future plans, to protect their growth plans, to protect their customers and to keep their customers that they currently have, this all still needs to be considered. There's no point deciding to install a solar system on a building when in 3 or 4 years' time, you're not going to be there because you're too big. So all of this has to be taken into account. Also, legalities can often have a very big negative impact on what is possible to achieve. Who owns the building? How often is the lease for? Are they going to be developed in the local area? Is a high-rise building going to go next door that's going to block the sun, and so on? All of this has to be considered. But while the outcome between homes and business cut their carbon footprint the same, as I mentioned, the needs and reasons for investing are very different. I'll very quickly go through artificial intelligence. So I'll explain for the most part what that is, and then give a quick example on how all of that data I mentioned earlier can be fed through an artificial intelligence network to help answer those questions. So we're no longer looking at a linear problem solving, it's a non-linear problem. So AI is basically a computer that's able to think or act in a more human way by taking in data from its surroundings, and it decides the response on what it learns and what it senses. So it's true that AI requires the use of machine learning, and machine learning is a form of AI that allows a computer to learn and relearn from previous decisions and experience. That's the crucial difference. So an AI system just takes data, gives an answer. Machine learning re-looks at that answer to relearn if it was correct, or if it made the right decision, or how it can improve. And machine learning requires the use of a neural network. And that picture there is a basic neural network. To think of a neural network, think of it like neurons within a brain. The network is a layer of nodes. Each fires into the next from left to right, and there are three main types: an input layer, hidden layers, which could be at least one, but often multiples, and then some output layers. Naturally, the more input layers, the greater number of multiple hidden layers. And although that's in the 2D sphere, you can also think of it as in 3D, as hidden layers go outwards to come back again, like a diamond. So how do they work? So each node is basically a small calculator with multiple inputs. Each of the inputs typically have a value between 0 and 1. Why? Well, you may mention earlier, answer questions between yes, we need to charge, no, we don't. 1 could be seen as a yes, 0 could be a no. And values in between still hold a very high meaning. For example, 0.75 could be yes, but it could be attributed to an error in the calculations or an input data. So machine learning can pick that up. Or 0.75 could be yes, only charged for 3/4 of an hour. So they all carry a meaning. These inputs that I mentioned are weighted, and they're often multiplied by a predetermined number. That's recalculated if it's machine learning to give it balance. The nodes then sum all of that data up apply the bias, give it an output value. That output value is then passed on to the next node, which has an input, and it carries on and on and on. Now, machine learning is the application for the whole network to relearn, as I mentioned, and it redefines the bias value. Neural network will then check those outputs for the known results to relearn. That's the crucial difference. So neural network is now ready to use live and unlearned data on its inputs. But what's the application to energy? So this is a very quick example. As you can see, the needs has come in, I need to charge 70% for an hour. The charge is at 20%. That's going into another node. There'll be other data such as what the battery temperature is and so on that I mentioned earlier. They feed into the middle layer. It will decide, oh, okay, so I could need an additional 50% for 1 hour's time. There's also enough solar for 2 hours charge. An output could be, based on previous data, yes, charge at 50% power. That's how that, in a nutshell, is how these systems work. Another key development in battery storage is blockchain. So blockchain is a way of making and tracking those transactions of energy and trading. And blockchain is processed in a decentralized way with multiple computers. They validate the transaction that's occurred in real time. Now, because it's in real time, it makes blockchain very secure and trustworthy. Don't confuse blockchain with Bitcoin. It uses the same platform, but it's very different. A basic decentralized ledger that blockchain produces is secure, and it allows the data to be tracked and verified and updated. So we're now removing the errors from the data. We can use blockchain to show true data. Quite simple, really. It's just a ledger. But let's just quickly look at what that means in energy. So let's say we mentioned earlier, the storage unit needs more power. The unit sends a transaction request to the cloud network of nodes. The network nodes validates a transaction. This is still blockchain, remember. The validated transaction is then added to the ledger on the blockchain. So it just keeps growing. Every time the storage unit, battery storage unit needs more charge, it just keeps adding to the ledger. The transfer of the energy is completed within the hardware. The ledger gets updated, completed, and the controller, who can see the blockchain, which can also still be a computer, can review the ledger and confirm the initial source of power. So we're now confirming where businesses and certainly residential power is coming from. Who are those generators? Now, to end the presentation, I'm going to go through a case study of a typical SME building an office-based environment that is very close to us. This is in Borden in Hampshire. It's set for multiple offices across various sectors. So that's the picture of the building there, and that's a picture of the floor plan. Now, what problems did they have? Well, they had a lot of power cuts. Businesses, they really wanted to cut their carbon. They're growing businesses, they're exciting new businesses. They want to help decarbonise supply chains from larger companies, even and locally too. But crucially, looking to save on the energy bill. But why were they having problems with looking at systems in the first place? Well, it's multiple different businesses across different markets. They all share the same internet here in the building. People work here till late, some people work at the weekends. Usage of the building varies. It has a wonderful business lounge for people to come and go. It has networking events and so on. So it's not a typical usage building. Solar investment here is just not possible. There's legal requirements around the building that mean that the people who occupy it don't own it. But crucially, the shaping of the roof, because it's a very old building, built in 1903, and it's an old army officers block, the roof shape just doesn't allow for it. So the solution that we provided is to use smaller units throughout an entire corridor and in each of the small businesses. So what does this mean? It means that the cost, what they were trying to do is cut the cost of energy from moving out of the red banded tariffs, but also track the low grid carbon. So we're now starting to actively use the power from when local energy is at its greenest and cleanest. By using that, we can help those businesses advertise that they are saving carbon. They can attract those future businesses and customers who are having interest in spending that money with them, but also it's saving their costs, so it's a double win. Interestingly, because at the site of the building, I'll just quickly go back to the previous slide, you'll see that the car park is very difficult to locate where a battery storage solution could be. The grid network nearby, although there's been a lot of housing development, it's still quite old. It can't cope with huge amounts of power, particularly electric vehicles and so on at the moment. So looking at what that could mean as future investment in the region, to say, well, that site can now have battery storage, because when that's being used, the in-building batteries can protect the local power needs. And this means that future investments can now quite happily take place, knowing that they are securing their energy needs. So hopefully this presentation has shown the very broad overview of what a battery solution could be, how it can benefit businesses, but also how all of this data and all of this technology has developed to a point where now is the time to really consider what it means for you and how you can go on your net zero journey. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me today, and I will pass back to Keith to help me in answering some of your questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was excellent. We do have a number of questions. That, don't stop sharing the slides yet.
Okay, sorry.
The first question is about slide 5, which is the first one with a graph on it.
Right.
It's probably best to go back to that one.
Slide 5.
Yep.
That one?
That one, yep. So the other Andrew Armstrong asks, what's the scale for the colour representation of the temperature, bottom left of the first slide?
What's the scale?
The scale, yes.
Essentially, what Ed Hawkins and the team have done, they said that the darker the blue is the more extreme of the colder temperatures that have occurred in that time, and the darker the red are when there's been higher extremes of higher temperatures. When it comes to what they actually mean in degrees C, I'll be honest, I don't know. But it'd be I would highly recommend Googling Ed Hawkins and the University of Reading, because you can create your own for the local area, and that produces quite a lot of information that will probably help answer that question.
Excellent. So Kevin Field asks, does it really make sense to store electricity in batteries for domestic heating purposes? Is anyone looking at heat storage as a means of storing energy? And we've had somewhere down here, somebody made a comment. Yes, Mark Holmes makes a comment, have a look at SunAmp heat batteries.
Yeah, I was literally just about to mention them.
So,
as I mentioned earlier, yeah, so storage of energy comes in many forms. You're quite right, as this is predominantly electricity presentation, but heat, yeah, very good question. And I know the SunAmp guys well. They're very interesting technology. And what you're finding is, although yes, you are right, it is storing heat, it still has an electrical input. That's a crucial thing too. By looking at it, SunAmp's an interesting, and the technology behind SunAmp is very interesting too. It's not applicable to some areas at the moment, but how can I say it? It depends, as I mentioned earlier, it depends on the needs of the people that are looking. If you're looking to store energy over a long period, for example, one of the questions you need to look at when you're looking at storing heat is, do you need a lot of it in a short space of time? Are you happy to have it released over a long period? Now, I know some do both, but they're crucial questions in understanding what technologies and how you can do that. And once you ask those questions, you can start to look at whether electricity is the key in doing so, or looking at other methods of technologies for doing that. But yeah, SunAmp, yeah, very well picked up on.
Okay, Chris Coffin asks, when is battery storage going to be truly economical for the typical house with a 4 kilowatts of solar panels on the roof?
Again, good question. That's a very difficult one to answer because it does depend on the circumstances. If you, for example, have a 4 kilowatt system and you're using it all, the answer is there's no point having battery solutions if you're only looking to store excess. If you're looking at using batteries to, if you are using it all and there's still more power that you need, but you can't put solar in, for example, batteries can help you shift your demand into the cheaper periods. You'd have to look at why you'd need it. When it comes to economical viability, there's often a need from some to look at exporting power. And in the large part for residential, even we've struggled to make that economically viable, because in doing so, you've got to spend quite a lot more, what I would call capital costs, upfront costs for the actual batteries. For example, just a quick example, let's say there is an opportunity to export power, but you're already consuming that battery, because at the end of the day, when you need to export power, the prices are high, but you're protecting yourself. Not only does your system have to protect you, it now has to provide the grid. That's a double, what I'll call a double whammy. The second you're starting to provide a solution for two, your costs are going to go up. So consider what it is you're trying to achieve when you're looking at that need. I'm happy to send me an email if you want to ask me further on. But have a look at what that need is that you need to achieve by using batteries. And in some parts of the UK at the moment, it isn't economically viable. What we do see is as renewables become more the dominant power provider within the grid, coupled with the increasing demand in things like electric vehicles that come on, those fluctuations will start to sting. And protecting yourselves from that might be a future need. Might not be now, but it might come at a later date.
Thank you. Mark asks, with decarbonisation, the thermal load is being migrated to heat pumps. How well do batteries cope with the stop-start nature and large inrush currents of heat pump systems?
Yeah, very good question. Think of it as a time-based problem. So a heat pump will take a lot of power, milliseconds, to get going, maybe up to 1, okay? Once it's running, you don't need the huge inrush of current. And that's where battery systems typically come into play. I do know inrush current is a big problem for a lot of battery solutions, particularly when it comes to inverters. But if you're looking at a shift away in the future innovation from that, as I mentioned earlier, the shift from DC to AC as an output, and the DC feeds potentially directly into the heat pump, those inrush currents are no problem because batteries will just give. But understanding how much it needs and when, the data still has a big role. Looking at peak power usage, you also have to think about it as a time-based need as well, to understand the difference between power and power for watt hours. That's the large differences that you have to think about.
Okay, the next question is from an anonymous person. Do your CO2 figures take into account the construction replacement of solar panels and wind power generators, or I guess any other renewable energy source?
All of the data that I have is third party. I'll be honest, I don't know directly from your question. What I can say is that a lot of the CO2 data comes from what's called the BEIS, which is the Business Department of Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK. They're called the BEIS conversion factors. And energy has a fixed CO2 equivalent, which includes all of the greenhouse gases. So when a business, particularly a council, if we look at a council, produces its carbon footprint report, they're all collated to produce those figures nationally through the department BEIS within the UK. So to answer your question, I would say yes, they almost certainly do, because the businesses want, sorry, the councils and the businesses that have those solar farms will want to show that they have offset that carbon. The content of carbon within solar panels, and that's generated through manufacturing, is a more complicated answer. So I could talk about this. This could be another presentation, but to be very, very quick, there's different scopes that are used to calculate a carbon footprint. Scopes 1, 2, and 3 are typically mentioned. And scopes 2 are the energy that you consume. And scope 3 will be the energy from, or the carbon footprint, shall I say, from a supply chain, so further down. Very quickly, let's just look at, say, if you're manufacturing food, your scope 2 energy is the food. Your scope 3 will be the packaging that it comes from. If that's then sold onto a supermarket, they put it on the shelf, their scope 2 is the energy that's consumed in keeping it cool, but their scope 3 will be the manufacturer's scope 2. So in understanding how that all comes together to create these figures, it's quite a complicated document. To help answer that more fully, I would refer the question, the person who asked the question, forgive me, I've forgotten your name, to the Bayes conversion factors. And if you can't find it, feel free to drop me an email and I will point you in the right direction.
Thanks, Paul. I've got 3 questions here that are of sort of complementary nature, so I'm going to ask you all 3 questions at the same time. With a scale of 1 to 5, what scale of efficiency and sustainability would you indicate for solid-state batteries? That's the first question. The second question is, how efficient are multi-battery inverter systems? And the third question is, when a solar panel is going to be truly economic for a typical house, never mind batteries?
Okay, I was just writing those down so I don't forget.
I can give them to you one at a time.
So the efficiency of solid state batteries have been talked about for a long time. They've been trialed. There's a lot of work out there at the moment in the scientific sphere, so it's still at university level. I've not seen solid state batteries come through into commercial setting that actually makes it viable for mass manufacture, and that's the crucial thing in the difference between science and engineering, as I'm sure most of our audience know. The efficiency of solid state, well, crikey, that comes down to how well it's manufactured. It's a very difficult thing to say. They are seen to be, and the data does suggest that they are more efficient, but there's not much data there to make that believable as an engineer. So I've answered that. I know I've answered that badly because I'm giving you a firm answer. And also, I don't know. It's still too new, but it's very much worth watching. So how efficient, Keith, you have to mind a second, how efficient are
multi-battery inverter systems?
Multi-battery inverter systems. I'm guessing the question's referring to our model and the product that we do as opposed to a single standalone. If that's the case, because one of the things that we noticed very early on, for example, if you wanted to support an entire building, you would have to have either multiple inverters, an extremely large inverter, and then a large stack of batteries. And the target, therefore, typically becomes one output feeding an entire building. When it comes to multiple solutions within a building, the model we have has shown that they can isolate sections of the building. So you're no longer holding power typically external to the building. You can start to shift power into wings of a building to support something that might be happening in a week or two's time. So by having that spread nature, and I mentioned to the data earlier, you're now looking at a better level of control. Remember, I mentioned one output from that system means that it's one level of control. By spreading your systems, as we do throughout a building, you can, particularly for businesses, this is important for businesses, if they grow and they shrink or they change or they move or their operations or their customers shift, it's very handy to move them systems around to support that business that they need. So from a that perspective of efficiency extends beyond energy and into the life of a product and what that means for that user. And now, final question, when is solar going to be economical for residential? To be honest, it kind of is now. I know a lot of people have done extremely well out of solar, not installers, users, that I'd say now's the cusp of what that really means economically. The difficulty comes in the legislation of the UK as to whether you can be defined as a generator or not and how much you're producing. So for residential, look at, if you have some already and are looking to make it better, have a look at what's happening in the spheres I mentioned in community energy and how people can work together to access the more lucrative, what I will say, the more lucrative generation capacities that deal directly with the grid. They're coming through. It's new software, new technologies all the time. And the last thing you want to do is kind of miss that boat. So everything will be economically better as time goes on. That's the important factor. When I would say we're on the cusp of it now.
Thank you. So this is an interesting question. Does the use of blockchain use much energy? You talked about using blockchain. This question is arising from recent articles about Bitcoin, and it uses a huge amount of power to actually run Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mentioned in my presentation it's like Bitcoin, but nothing like Bitcoin. Bitcoin, I showed in the slide the ledger. See if I can quickly shoot through to it. It's one transaction. It's no different to just storing a line of data. It's the method by which it's stored that gives it the security. With blockchain, it's a ledger within a ledger within a ledger within a ledger, and that's when it becomes extremely resource hungry. It's the pyramid scheme system that the blockchain has that makes it very power hungry. To be quite direct at the moment, the answer to that question, they're very different. Don't confuse the two.
Thank you. Aluminium-based batteries have 10 times the capacity of similar lithium batteries, but the problem has been they cannot be recharged. But progress is being made in this regard. Can you comment on the current state of development of rechargeable aluminium batteries, and when do you think such batteries will be available with the 10 times storage of lithium?
Yeah, I've followed aluminium for a while. We were contacted by a business that had investments must be 2-3 years ago when they were looking at aluminium batteries. For powerQuad, first for powerQuad in its own right, and I mentioned earlier, we don't really care too much about what the storage device is, so long as the data is there and you adapt it. For example, flywheels are very good. They can take a long time to charge up, but they release a lot of power very, very quickly. That's very different to a lot of batteries. So the medium by which you're looking at the storage device can make a very big difference on your decision. Aluminium, again, it's like solid state. It's pretty new and it's still being developed. I mean, to be fair, look, even if it had a very slow charge and a very quick discharge, you know, that there's still room for that. If you think, as I mentioned earlier, typically battery solutions at the moment look at what's happening halfway through the day. They charge up and dispense it at night. But it's also important to look at a longer time-based period. What will happen over a week, a month, a quarter? Do you need to start to charge up for 6 months to be prepared for the winter months, and so on and so forth? So the storage medium changes. Quick example, hydro in the UK has been used for many, many years. UK, I think, has led the way really in storage for the grid. You look at reservoirs in Wales, they take 2 or 3 days sometimes to take all the water back up into the well, but they release it in 30 minutes to an hour. So consider that sort of scenario for the technology. Aluminium, follow it. There's always new stuff coming through. It's exciting. It is exciting.
James Wolford asks, what are the efficiencies of decentralisation?
A lot. I'll answer that with a scenario that I often get asked about. But if we just create some big nuclear power stations, what's the point of doing wind? Well, if you create a huge system, like a many gigawatts power system, say Sellafield, right? If you, I'm in Guildford, let's say Guildford has everyone charging their cars and the need. Power station, what, right next to Guildford just for an hour, just to cover that need. So when you're looking at moving that energy through the grid and the network over that period or that time, that's when the efficiencies of decentralization occur, because you can start to create smaller generators, and a generator could still be a battery solution that's taken that huge power to store for a week's time, for example, to say, right, we know that, because it could be a town that's in a valley that gets very warm, or it could be a town that's up high that gets very cold or damp. They have different needs, and getting the power to them over time to decentralize that need, in other words, moving the responsibility down the chain, can create some huge efficiencies. And the largest efficiency comes in that the grid doesn't have to spend billions digging up the road to put chunkier cables into the ground to carry current for a peak 1 hour to 2 hour use of the evening. If the decentralized system can cope, the efficiencies both in energy and transport of energy and the cost of doing so are quite immense. So it's a key point to net zero, really. Good question, though.
An interesting question I don't understand, so I'll see if you do. Angela asks, what are the typical round-trip losses for modern battery storage?
If you're referring to the batteries in their own right, yeah, okay. I refer to data that's available freely on electric vehicles and their batteries, and the early EV providers back in 2012, 13, 14, certainly Nissan Leaf, BMW i3 models, how their systems are still going strong, and even the manufacturer suppliers by how well they perform for the life of what they, even their warranties provided, they're performing far better. So round trip of those are actually looking better than the initial data that came out. Round trip when you're looking at things including the charging circuits and the inverter circuits, again, it depends on the manufacturer. The cheaper the product tends to be, the worse it is. The more expensive the product, the better it is. The amount of power can be a factor. The change in voltage that it charges at and so on can be a factor. I mean, it could be anywhere from 5 to 30% of error in inefficiencies in the full cycle between charge and discharge. Again, depending on the manufacturer. But it's worth looking at if that's an important factor for you. But when you're considering it, look at what that actually means as well. So a 10% error on 1 kilowatt hour, for example, is that important to you or not? It might be worthwhile questions.
Alan asks, how long does it take to offset the environmental cost of manufacturing the batteries?
Oh, well, again, they're models in large, right? If I'm afraid I can't, that's a very difficult one to answer. The contained carbon within a storage device is a key factor in helping understand how you can offset that. To consider that, look at things like the Bayes conversion factors I mentioned, the scopes, whose are those? So for example, and this is, you can align this question with things like air conditioning. If the air conditioning is, and the manufacture of the air conditioning is run purely on green energy and it's recycled parts and so on and so forth, it's going to be a lot lower. The sad fact is that the drive for net zero hasn't allowed the circular economy to support it as yet when it comes to that need to look at the carbon of the entire system and the entire product and the batteries as a whole. However, I'll refer again to my previous response about EVs, that they are seeing them last a lot longer than they initially planned. So it's a very worthwhile question that should continue to be asked, but the answer is still, let's see, in the broadest terms. But it is getting better. Certainly when you look at things like lead acid batteries and the life they took and the difficulty they took in sometimes recycling. So yeah, it's a good question, but keep looking. It's improving all the time.
Another good question. Phil Rudd asks, could the development of supercapacitors get anywhere near the capacity of batteries? They are far superior to batteries in respect of charging and discharging rates, but are they practical?
Yeah, very good question. At the moment, supercapacitors are too small to provide the power that's required, but they are very good at charging and discharging. I agree with that comment. They're also extremely good with a lot of cycles. So they're worth considering if you know you have to do charge and discharge a lot for, say, every 2 to 3 minutes. And some electronics do work like that. So they'll charge up. When it charges up, it will perform an action. It will wait for the solar panel on it to charge up again and so on. So it's kind of self-usage. Supercapacitors is very interesting. I know it's being used quite a lot in space applications to reduce the payload weight for batteries. So when there's a lot of focus on that and there's a lot of investment in that, I can see supercapacitors being improved in the amount of power that they can provide. And like with batteries, there's new things happening all the time. But yeah, supercapacitor is another good storage device. I'm actually going to add that to my list.
Thanks, Paul. I think this is going to be the last question because we're running out of time. Sorry to those that we haven't managed to answer, but we will try to answer them and put the answers onto the IET Berkshire website. So look out on the website for those answers in the next week or so. So the last question neatly follows on from the previous one in terms of battery technology. Lithium phosphate batteries only offer circa 4,000 cycles and are expensive on resources to make. Zinc bromide flow batteries look to offer a better solution for grid storage at less resource costs. Are you aware of any UK manufacturers working on zinc bromide flow batteries?
I have heard of it. Forgive me, I can't remember where. I have heard of zinc bromide.
So apparently they're being used down under in New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah, no, I have heard of them here in the UK on a more research sphere. LFP cells that were first mentioned in that question as 4,000 cycles. But there's new stuff coming through, and sadly, it is largely in China. They really do lead the way in both quality and cost of LFP cells. You're in excess of 10,000 now, easy, if not more. It's in the last 12 to 18 months, it has come on in a phenomenal way, largely because the cell voltages have increased. So, yeah. I have heard of zinc bromide. I haven't heard of it being used in the UK or any manufacturing. I do know that there is a lot of battery recycling happening currently in the UK. There's quite a lot of government backing for the circular economy on that, and across all types of batteries, not just fixed on one. That's another area that's worth looking at when it comes to battery types. But yeah, zinc bromide, I don't know. If I can find, if you feel free to drop me an email, and if I can find anything that crops up, I will be happy to let you know. I'm sure I have something somewhere hidden away.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for all the questions. Sorry we didn't get through all of them, but as I said, we will put the answers on the IET Berkshire website. So along with the replay of this webinar and the slides from Paul. So it's all going to be there in the next week or so. Lastly, I just need to thank Paul for spending the evening with us and giving his insight into energy storage. It's been really interesting. Thank you very much, Paul. I'll give you a virtual round of applause.
Thanks for having me, and thank you to all the attendees who've stuck it through. I hope it's been very helpful to you. And as I say, my email is there if there's anything that's missed, and any questions that have still been missed, I shall answer. I promise I'll get to them.
Thank you and good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.